They said she was too emotional for combat operations. Too soft for the Rangers. Too small to survive the fall. But when Indigo Robinson plummeted 800 feet from a sabotaged helicopter without a parachute, she didn't scream. She calculated. While her squad watched in horror, certain she was dead, Indigo was already planning her survival, her extraction, and her revenge. What they didn't know was that being underestimated had always been her greatest weapon. This is the story of how a Ranger everyone dismissed became the soldier no one could forget. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The Alpine training facility sat at 6,000 feet in the Austrian mountains, a place where the European Defense Force tested its most elite soldiers. Indigo Robinson stood at the edge of the helicopter pad at 0530 hours, watching the sunrise paint the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp mountain air, and her hands wrapped around a metal cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She'd been stationed at the facility for 11 months, and every morning felt identical. The same dismissive glances. The same whispered comments. The same crushing weight of being perpetually invisible despite wearing the same Ranger patch as every other soldier on the base. At 23 years old, Indigo stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed barely 115 pounds. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes carried an intensity that most people mistook for emotional instability. Her fellow Rangers had nicknamed her Tears Behind Her Back, a cruel reference to the one time she'd cried during a particularly brutal psychological evaluation. Not because she'd broken down, but because she'd scored higher than anyone in the program's history, and the evaluator had accused her of cheating. The accusation had been investigated and dismissed. The nickname had stuck. The briefing hall buzzed with anticipation as she entered. Digital screens covered every wall, displaying satellite imagery, topographical maps, and weather patterns. Commander Erich Volkov stood at the front, his stern expression carved from years of commanding elite operations. Indigo found her usual spot in the back row, her tablet ready, though she already anticipated what was coming. Today's operation is codenamed Frostbite, Volkov announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. We have intelligence suggesting that a terrorist cell is operating from a compound in Sector 9. Heavy fortifications, difficult terrain, extreme weather conditions. I need my best operatives on this mission. Indigo's stylus hovered over her tablet as Volkov began reading assignments. Petrov, your team leader. Daniels, you're his second. O'Connor, you handle explosives. Fitzgerald, you're on communications. The names continued, each one representing months of training alongside Indigo. She'd outscored most of them in tactical analysis, could navigate terrain maps with photographic precision, and had memorized every assault protocol in the Ranger handbook. But when the real missions came up, she was always assigned to support roles. Robinson. Volkov's voice cut through her thoughts. You're on equipment verification and mission documentation. Make sure all gear is accounted for pre- and post-operation. Equipment verification. Again. Indigo nodded curtly, her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of disappointment. Around her, the selected operatives exchanged confident nods and quiet words of encouragement. She might as well have been a filing cabinet. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten. Lieutenant Petrov was speaking to O'Connor near the tactical display, their voices low but not low enough. Thank God Robinson isn't coming with us, Petrov muttered. Last thing we need is someone having an emotional breakdown in the middle of a firefight. She's capable, O'Connor replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Her test scores are actually impressive. Test scores don't mean anything when bullets start flying. I've seen her cry during evaluations. Can you imagine what she'd do under real pressure? Besides, if things go wrong and we need to carry someone out, she wouldn't last 5 minutes in that terrain. Indigo pretended to study her tablet, but every word carved itself into her memory. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Too emotional. Too weak. Too much of a liability. It didn't matter that she'd never broken down during actual operations, that her emotional label came from scoring too high on empathy assessments, or that she could carry a 70-pound pack for 20 miles without complaint. The worst part was understanding their reasoning. In combat situations, physical strength mattered. But it wasn't everything. Her ability to read people, to anticipate behavior patterns, to remain calm in chaos, these skills were invisible until they were desperately needed. As the assault team prepared for deployment, Indigo walked to the equipment depot and pulled out her personal gear. Hidden beneath regulation items was a collection of materials she'd been assembling for months. Detailed topographical studies of every sector within 100 miles. Weather pattern analyses. Emergency survival protocols for extreme conditions. Psychological profiles of known terrorist operators in the region. Nobody had asked her to compile this information. Nobody knew she was doing it. But Indigo had learned long ago that being ready for opportunity was the only way to create it when the world insisted on keeping you on the sidelines. The helicopters lifted off at 0700 hours, their rotors thundering across the facility as they disappeared into the mountain valleys. Indigo stood on the tarmac, watching until they were just dark specks against the brilliant blue sky, then turned back to her assigned duties. She had equipment manifests to verify, documentation to update, and a growing sense that today would be different. She just didn't know how different yet. 3 weeks had passed since the Frostbite mission, a successful raid that had earned the assault team commendations and Indigo another day of counting ammunition supplies. She'd watched the celebration from across the mess hall, sipping her tea and trying to ignore the familiar hollow feeling in her chest. But something had shifted in those 3 weeks. The whispers had started immediately after the team's return, spreading through the facility like wildfire through dry grass. Not about the mission itself, but about her. The first incident occurred during a routine equipment audit. Sergeant Davies had asked her to verify inventory counts for the helicopter maintenance bay, a simple enough task that should have taken 30 minutes. Except Davies's tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "You're absolutely certain about these numbers, Robinson?" Davies had asked, tapping his clipboard with unnecessary force. "Because if equipment is going missing and you're not catching it, that's going to reflect poorly on your competence." Indigo had triple-checked every item. The numbers were accurate, as they always were. But Davies's doubt planted a seed that began growing throughout the facility like poison ivy climbing a fence. Other incidents followed in quick succession. Her tactical analyses were questioned more aggressively during briefings. Her equipment requests sat in pending status for days longer than normal. During physical training sessions, she caught sidelong glances when she outperformed expectations, as if her competence itself was somehow suspicious. The breaking point came during a briefing about advanced helicopter operations and emergency protocols. Indigo sat in her usual position, taking meticulous notes on new safety procedures and equipment specifications, when she heard her name mentioned in a conversation 2 rows ahead. "I'm just saying, Robinson spends an awful lot of time studying flight mechanics," Private Garrett was whispering to his companion. "More than someone in equipment verification really needs to know." "What are you implying?" the other soldier asked. "Maybe nothing. But she's always asking questions about helicopter systems, emergency procedures, stuff that's way outside her assignment parameters. Makes you wonder what she's really planning." Indigo's stylus stopped moving. She stared at the back of Garrett's head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Her dedication to understanding how things worked, her desire to be prepared for any situation, was being twisted into something questionable. Something threatening. After the briefing, she cornered Garrett near the ammunition depot, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her like pressure in a sealed container. "Is there something you want to say to me directly, Garrett?" Garrett looked uncomfortable, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. His face flushed slightly, caught between embarrassment and defensiveness. "Look, Robinson, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, you have to admit you're pretty intense about things that aren't exactly your responsibility." "My responsibility is ensuring this unit functions effectively," Indigo replied, her words measured and precise. That means understanding every system, every protocol, every possible failure point. I'm sorry if my thoroughness makes you uncomfortable. Hey, don't get all emotional about it, Garrett said, the words landing like a slap. I'm just saying maybe you should focus on what you're actually assigned to do instead of trying to prove something to everyone. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Indigo had spent 11 months proving herself through competence and dedication, had earned respect through sheer professionalism, and now that was being questioned because she cared too much about excellence. She walked away without another word, but the damage was done. Over the following days, she noticed more changes. Her suggestions during briefings were met with polite dismissal. Her requests for additional training certifications were quietly denied. Even Lieutenant Sophia Reyes, one of the few female officers who'd previously been supportive, seemed to be keeping her distance. The isolation intensified when Commander Volkov called her into his office for what he termed a performance discussion. Indigo sat across from his desk, her service records spread between them like evidence at a trial. The office was Spartan, decorated only with commendations and tactical maps, everything in its place except for her apparently. Robinson, you're technically proficient, Volkov began, his fingers drumming against the desk in a rhythm that matched her accelerating heartbeat. Your attention to detail is comprehensive. But there have been concerns raised about your focus and priorities. What kind of concerns, sir? Indigo asked, keeping her voice neutral. The kind that suggest you might be more interested in duties outside your assigned role. I need personnel who are focused on their specific responsibilities, not distracted by operations they're not qualified for. Indigo felt something cold settle in her stomach. Sir, I've never neglected my assigned duties. My performance evaluations have been consistently excellent. That's not the issue. The issue is scope. You're studying advanced helicopter mechanics, tactical assault procedures, high-altitude survival techniques, all things that fall outside your area of responsibility. It's creating questions about your intentions and your judgment. My intentions are to be the best ranger I can be, sir. To be ready for whatever situation might arise. Volkov leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that seemed to calculate her worth like a piece of equipment being evaluated for disposal. The situations that might arise for you involve equipment management, Robinson. Nothing more. I'm going to need you to scale back the extracurricular activities. Focus on your actual assignment. Indigo left the office feeling like she'd been punched in the chest, the air knocked from her lungs. Her dedication was being treated as a character flaw. Her preparation as potential insubordination. She was being systematically pushed into a smaller and smaller box, told to limit herself to the narrow role others had decided she was suited for. That night, she sat in her quarters staring at the detailed helicopter schematics she'd been studying, months of careful work mapping every system, every potential failure point, every emergency procedure. She thought about putting them away, about accepting the limitations others had placed on her like chains she was supposed to wear gratefully. Instead, she folded them carefully and tucked them into her personal gear. If today had taught her anything, it was that being ready wasn't just about seizing opportunity. It was about survival in a system designed to keep her grounded. CTA after approximately 1,500 words/10 minutes, we've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The emergency alarm shattered the morning quiet at 0847 hours on a Thursday that had begun like any other. Indigo was updating maintenance logs in the equipment bay when the klaxon's piercing wail sent her running toward the command center, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The radio chatter was chaotic, voices overlapping in a cacophony of panic and static. Through the noise, she caught fragments that made her blood run cold. Helicopter compromised. Sector 12. Sabotage suspected. Multiple casualties possible. She pushed through the gathering crowd of personnel until she could see the command center's primary display screen. A red dot pulsed on the digital map, marking a helicopter's position in mountainous terrain 40 miles from the facility. The aircraft was still airborne, but something was clearly wrong. Commander Volkov stood at the center of the controlled chaos, his face grim as he coordinated the emergency response. Baker, get rescue birds in the air immediately. Reyes, contact Regional Command and inform them of the situation. Daniels, pull up the flight recorder data. Sir, the communications officer called out, her voice tight with tension. The pilot reports hydraulic failure and control system malfunction. They're losing altitude rapidly. He's attempting an emergency landing, but the terrain is extremely hostile. Indigo watched the satellite feed showing the helicopter's position. The aircraft was over a series of steep valleys and rocky outcroppings, the kind of terrain that turned emergency landings into death sentences. But she'd studied this area extensively, knew there was a small plateau approximately 3 miles from the helicopter's current position that could work for an emergency landing if the pilot could maintain control long enough to reach it. She stepped forward, her voice clear despite the chaos surrounding her like a storm. Sir, there's a potential landing zone at coordinates 472 by 893. It's a plateau with sufficient clearance for emergency landing. Volkov turned, his expression shifting from intense focus to irritation. Robinson, this is not the time for unsolicited input. We have trained flight coordinators handling this situation. Sir, I've mapped every potential landing zone within 50 miles of this facility. That plateau is the helicopter's best option given their current trajectory and rate of descent. Are you questioning the judgment of my flight coordination team? Volkov's voice carried a dangerous edge. I'm providing information that could save lives, sir. Indigo held her ground, aware that every eye in the command center was now focused on her, most filled with disbelief or disapproval. Lieutenant Petrov interjected from his position at the tactical display. With all due respect, Commander, Robinson is equipment verification. She's not qualified to make tactical recommendations for flight emergencies. The communications officer's voice cut through the argument. Sir, the pilot reports he's losing control. He needs landing coordinates immediately, or he'll have to attempt a crash landing wherever they go down. Volkov stared at Indigo for a long moment, his jaw tight. Fine. Transmit Robinson's coordinates to the pilot. But if this goes wrong, it's on your head, Robinson. Indigo felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden, but she nodded. Understood, sir. The command center fell silent except for the radio chatter as the pilot received the coordinates and altered course toward the plateau. Every second stretched into eternity as they watched the helicopter's icon crawl across the digital map, its altitude dropping steadily. They're not going to make it, someone whispered behind Indigo. They're losing altitude too fast. But Indigo had calculated the vectors, had factored in wind resistance and the helicopter's glide ratio. They would make it. Barely, but they would make it. The helicopter reached the plateau with less than 30 seconds of controlled flight remaining. The landing was hard, violent even, but the aircraft remained intact. Through the satellite feed, they could see personnel evacuating the damaged helicopter, alive and mobile. The command center erupted in relieved conversation, but Indigo barely heard it. Because she'd noticed something in the flight recorder data that no one else seemed to have caught yet. Something that changed everything. The maintenance report came through 2 hours after the emergency landing, and Indigo was the first to read it. Her position in equipment verification meant she received all technical reports automatically, a bureaucratic detail that was about to become critically important. The helicopter's hydraulic failure hadn't been mechanical. It had been sabotage. Someone had deliberately tampered with the control systems, and they'd done it with enough sophistication to make it look like routine mechanical failure. The only reason it had been detected at all was because Indigo had implemented a new inspection protocol 3 months earlier, one that documented microscopic tool marks on sensitive components. She sat in her quarters, staring at the report with growing horror. The sabotage had been executed by someone with intimate knowledge of helicopter systems, someone with access to the maintenance bay, someone who knew exactly which components to compromise to create catastrophic failure without immediate detection. Someone on the base was trying to kill Rangers. Indigo's mind raced through possibilities, analyzing patterns and behaviors she'd observed over the past months. The whispered conversations about her studying helicopter mechanics. The resistance to her implementing new inspection protocols. The way certain personnel had seemed nervous when she asked detailed questions about equipment access logs. She opened her personal files, the ones she'd been maintaining despite being told to focus only on her assigned duties. Cross-referencing maintenance bay access logs with flight schedules, she began to see a pattern. 3 previous mechanical failures over the past 6 months, all on helicopters carrying specific personnel, all occurring in dangerous terrain. But who would benefit from eliminating Rangers? And why? The answer hit her like ice water. Not eliminate. Discredit. Someone wanted to make the European Defense Forces elite Ranger program look incompetent, to undermine confidence in their operations. And the best way to do that was through seemingly random equipment failures that suggested poor maintenance and oversight. Indigo gathered her evidence and headed toward Commander Volkov's office. The hallways were quiet in the late evening, most personnel either in their quarters or at the recreation facility. She was so focused on her documentation that she almost didn't notice the figure stepping out of the shadows near the command center. Lieutenant Petrov stood in her path, his expression unreadable in the dim corridor lighting. Robinson. Working late? Just reviewing maintenance reports, sir. There's something Commander Volkov needs to see immediately. About the helicopter incident? Petrov's tone was casual, but something in his posture made Indigo's instincts scream danger. I heard you were quite the hero, providing those landing coordinates. Just doing my job, sir. Your job. Petrov stepped closer, and Indigo noticed his hand resting near the sidearm on his belt. That's interesting, because I've been reviewing your job performance. You seem to have expanded your responsibilities considerably beyond equipment verification. Some might say you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Indigo's heart rate accelerated, but she kept her voice steady. Some might say I prevented a helicopter crash today, sir. Or some might say you knew exactly where that helicopter would experience problems because you've been studying our flight patterns and maintenance procedures for months. Tell me, Robinson, what does someone in equipment verification need with detailed knowledge of sabotage techniques? The accusation hung in the air between them like poison gas. Indigo understood in that moment that Petrov wasn't just questioning her, he was threatening her. And the only reason to threaten her was if she'd gotten too close to something he wanted to keep hidden. I think we both know I'm not the saboteur here, Lieutenant. Indigo's words were quiet but carried absolute conviction. Petrov's expression darkened. Careful, Robinson. Accusations like that can destroy a career. Especially when they come from someone whose emotional stability has been questioned repeatedly. My emotional stability isn't the issue. But I'm curious why you're so concerned about what I've been studying. The standoff in the corridor lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Petrov's hand remained near his weapon, his eyes calculating risks and options. Indigo stood her ground, her evidence folder pressed against her chest like a shield made of paper and truth. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Petrov said quietly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. There are bigger things at play here than you can possibly understand. Then explain it to me, sir. Help me understand why someone would sabotage helicopters and risk killing our own people. Petrov's laugh was bitter and cold. You really are naive, aren't you? You think this is about killing people? This is about showing the defense contractors that their equipment is flawed, that the Ranger program is too expensive and too dangerous to continue. Do you have any idea how much money is involved in military procurement? How many people profit from programs getting canceled and replaced? The admission hung between them like a confession made in darkness. Indigo's mind raced, putting together pieces she hadn't even known were missing. You're working for a defense contractor. You've been sabotaging missions to discredit the program. I'm working for the future of European defense, Petrov corrected. The current system is bloated and inefficient. My partners have better solutions, better technology. We're just helping the old guard realize it's time to step aside. By killing people? By creating controlled demonstrations of system failure. No one was supposed to die. The sabotage was calculated to cause failures in recoverable situations. Today's incident was unfortunate, but your interference actually proved my point. The system is so flawed that it takes an equipment clerk's lucky guess to prevent disaster. Indigo felt anger building in her chest like pressure in a sealed container. Those aren't systems failing. Those are people's lives you're gambling with for profit. And now you know too much. Petrov's hand moved toward his weapon with deadly intent. Which presents me with a problem that needs solving. Indigo didn't wait for him to draw. She threw her evidence folder directly at his face and ran, her smaller size and intimate knowledge of the facility's layout giving her a momentary advantage. She heard Petrov curse behind her, heard his boots pounding on the corridor floor as he gave chase. She needed to reach Commander Volkov's office, needed to get her evidence to someone in authority before Petrov could silence her permanently. But the commander's office was 2 corridors away, and Petrov was faster, stronger, and armed. Think, Indigo. Think like a ranger, not like prey. She ducked into a side corridor leading toward the helicopter maintenance bay, her mind calculating options and risks at lightning speed. The bay would be empty at this hour, but it also offered multiple exits and places to hide. More importantly, it contained evidence that would corroborate her accusations if she could just survive long enough to present it. The bay's massive doors loomed ahead, and Indigo slammed through them into the cavernous space beyond. 6 helicopters sat in various states of maintenance, their dark shapes like sleeping mechanical birds in the dim emergency lighting. She could hear Petrov entering behind her, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. "Robinson, you're only making this harder on yourself," Petrov called out, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "There's nowhere to run. Give me the evidence, and we can work something out." Indigo moved silently between the helicopters, her breath controlled despite her racing heart. She'd spent countless hours in this bay, knew every tool cabinet, every workbench, every hiding place. That knowledge was her only advantage now. She reached the maintenance office at the rear of the bay and grabbed the emergency radio from the wall mount, her fingers moving quickly across the controls to set it to the command frequency. But before she could transmit, Petrov's voice came from directly behind her. "Put it down, Robinson." She turned slowly to find him standing 10 feet away, his service pistol aimed steadily at her chest. In the dim light, his expression was almost apologetic. "I really wish you'd just stayed in your lane," he said quietly. "You're a good soldier. Too good, actually. That's your problem." Indigo's mind raced through scenarios, calculating probabilities and risks with the same analytical precision she'd applied to everything else in her life. Petrov had the weapon, had the physical advantage, had the position of authority that would make his version of events more believable than hers. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated her again. "You're right," Indigo said, her voice carrying a tremor that was only partially manufactured. "I should have stayed in my lane. I should have just counted equipment and kept my mouth shut like everyone wanted." She let tears well in her eyes, let her shoulders slump in apparent defeat. Playing into every stereotype they'd assigned her, every assumption they'd made about the emotional, weak woman who didn't belong in the Rangers. Petrov lowered his weapon slightly, his expression shifting from threat to something approaching pity. "It's not personal, Robinson. You just happen to be too thorough, too dedicated. In another situation, that would be admirable. Can I at least understand why?" Indigo asked, taking a small step forward, making herself seem smaller, less threatening. "Before you do whatever you're planning to do." "The defense industry is changing," Petrov explained, apparently unable to resist the opportunity to justify himself. "The old equipment is obsolete, but the military establishment refuses to modernize. My partners are offering revolutionary technology, but they need proof that the current systems are failing. A few calculated incidents, properly documented, and the contracts shift to better solutions. Better solutions that you profit from. Better solutions that save lives in the long run. You of all people should understand that sometimes the short-term costs are necessary for long-term benefits." Indigo took another small step forward, her hand moving slowly toward the tool belt hanging on a nearby workbench. And the Rangers who died in those calculated incidents? Were they just short-term costs? Regrettable but necessary. Petrov's weapon came back up, tracking her movement. And now you're going to be another regrettable necessity. A tragic accident in the maintenance bay. Maybe you were working late, maybe you fell from one of the helicopters. These things happen. They do happen, Indigo agreed. Her hand closed around a heavy torque wrench from the tool belt. But not to me. She threw the wrench with all her strength, not at Petrov but at the emergency power switch on the wall behind him. The bay plunged into complete darkness as the wrench struck home, and Indigo dropped and rolled, using the helicopter's landing gear as cover. Petrov fired twice, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the bay like lightning, but his shots went wide. He'd been aiming where she'd been standing, not where she'd moved to. Another assumption, another underestimation. Indigo crawled beneath the helicopter, her intimate knowledge of the bay's layout allowing her to move silently in the darkness while Petrov crashed into equipment and cursed. She reached the far side of the aircraft and pulled herself up to the pilot's access door, her fingers finding the emergency flare kit every helicopter carried. "You can't hide forever, Robinson," Petrov called out, his voice edged with frustration. "I know this bay as well as you do." But he didn't. Not really. He knew it as a pilot, someone who used the helicopters. She knew it as the person responsible for every piece of equipment, every safety protocol, every emergency system. She pulled out 3 flares and positioned them carefully around the bay, then ignited the first one. Petrov immediately fired toward the bright red light, but Indigo was already moving, lighting the second flare on the opposite side of the bay. He spun toward the new light source, his situational awareness degrading with each distraction. The third flare she dropped directly beside a fire alarm panel. The chemical flame triggered the bay's automatic fire suppression system, and suddenly the entire space filled with chemical foam and blaring alarms. Emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in strobing red. Through the chaos, Indigo saw Petrov stumbling, disoriented by the noise and foam. She grabbed the emergency radio she'd dropped earlier and transmitted on the command frequency. "This is Specialist Robinson in Maintenance Bay 3. Lieutenant Petrov is the saboteur responsible for the helicopter incidents. He's armed and has just attempted to kill me. I need immediate security response." Petrov roared with rage and charged toward her position, but the foam-slicked floor betrayed him. He went down hard, his weapon skittering away across the bay floor. Indigo was already moving, heading for the bay's emergency exit where she could hear security personnel responding to the fire alarm. As she burst through the exit into the night air, she ran directly into Commander Volkov, who was leading the security response team. His eyes widened as he took in her appearance, covered in chemical foam and breathing hard. "Robinson, what the hell is going on?" Behind her, security personnel were entering the bay, their weapons trained on Petrov, who was still trying to regain his footing on the foam-covered floor. "Sir," Indigo said, her voice finally steady despite everything she'd just survived. "I need to show you something about the helicopter sabotage. And you're not going to like it." The debriefing room felt smaller than it actually was, compressed by the weight of revelation and consequences. Indigo sat at the metal table, still wearing her foam-stained uniform, a medic's blanket draped around her shoulders despite her protests that she was fine. Commander Volkov sat across from her, flanked by 2 officers from the Military Intelligence Division who'd arrived within an hour of the incident. The evidence was spread across the table between them like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Maintenance logs with suspicious access patterns. Tool mark analysis showing deliberate tampering. Financial records that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from Intelligence had pulled, showing Petrov's connection to a defense contractor competing for next-generation helicopter contracts. "How long have you known?" Volkov asked, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. "How long have you been investigating this?" "I didn't know I was investigating anything, sir," Indigo replied honestly. "I was just trying to understand why equipment kept failing." When you implement proper inspection protocols and actually analyze the data, patterns emerge. I started seeing those patterns about 2 months ago, but I didn't understand what they meant until today. Hayes leaned forward, his expression intense. And you never reported these suspicions to anyone? I tried to report my concerns about the inspection protocols, sir. I was told to focus on my assigned duties and stop exceeding my scope. When I suggested implementing additional security measures for the maintenance bay, the request was denied. Indigo kept her voice neutral, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Volkov had the decency to look uncomfortable. You're saying we ignored warning signs because they came from someone we didn't take seriously. I'm saying that I was doing my job, sir. A job that apparently made some people uncomfortable because it didn't fit their expectations of what someone like me should be capable of. The other intelligence officer, Colonel Werner, spoke up for the first time. Petrov is claiming you're fabricating evidence to advance your career. He says you've been obsessed with proving yourself, that you've been studying sabotage techniques and could have orchestrated this entire scenario to make yourself look like a hero. Indigo felt a cold spike of fear, but forced herself to remain calm. With respect, sir, the evidence speaks for itself. The tool mark analysis predates today's incident by weeks. The financial records connecting Petrov to the defense contractor are independently verifiable. And there's security footage of him following me into the maintenance bay with his weapon drawn. Security footage that conveniently cuts out during the incident due to the fire suppression system, Werner countered. It's your word against a decorated lieutenant's about what actually happened in that bay. Not entirely, a new voice said from the doorway. Lieutenant Sophia Reyes entered, carrying a tablet. I pulled the audio logs from the maintenance bay's emergency communication system. It recorded everything before the fire suppression activated, including Lieutenant Petrov's confession about the sabotage and his motivation. She placed the tablet on the table and pressed play. Petrov's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. I'm working for the future of European defense. The current system is bloated and inefficient. My partners have better solutions, better technology. We're just helping the old guard realize it's time to step aside. The recording continued through his admission about the calculated sabotage, his attempt to justify the risks to human life, his threat to silence Indigo. When it ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Werner sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from skepticism to grim acceptance. That's conclusive. Petrov will face court-martial for treason, attempted murder, and conspiracy. What about the others? Indigo asked quietly. He mentioned partners. There are others involved in this. That's now a matter for military intelligence, Hayes said, standing. Your part in this is finished, Specialist Robinson. You've done more than enough. But Volkov was studying her with an expression Indigo couldn't quite read. Actually, I'm not sure her part is finished at all. The military investigation into the sabotage network took 3 weeks. During that time, Indigo found herself in a strange limbo between hero and liability. The Rangers who dismissed her for months now treated her with cautious respect, but there was also resentment simmering beneath the surface. She'd exposed corruption at the highest levels of their unit, and some viewed that as disloyalty rather than duty. The whispers changed but didn't stop. Instead of questioning her emotional stability, people now questioned her methods. She was running her own investigation without authorization. She deliberately withheld information from command. She took unnecessary risks instead of following proper channels. Indigo tried to ignore the criticism, focusing instead on her regular duties. But the truth was that her regular duties felt hollow now. After stopping a sabotage operation that had killed 3 Rangers over 6 months, returning to equipment manifests and inventory logs felt like being caged after flying. The summons to Commander Volkov's office came on a Friday morning. Indigo reported at precisely 0900 hours, her uniform immaculate, her expression neutral. She had no idea what to expect. Commendation? Punishment? Discharge? What she found was Volkov standing beside a woman she didn't recognize, a civilian in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an air of absolute authority. A third person was present via video conference, a general whose uniform carried enough ribbons and insignia to make Indigo's chest tight with nervousness. "Specialist Robinson," Volkov began, his tone formal. "This is Director Keller from the European Defense Intelligence Service. General Thornton is joining us from Brussels. They have a proposal for you." Keller stepped forward, offering her hand. "Specialist Robinson, your actions over the past weeks have brought you to our attention. Not just your role in exposing the sabotage network, but your entire approach to intelligence gathering and analysis." "I was just doing my job, ma'am," Indigo replied, shaking the offered hand. "That's precisely the point," Keller said with a slight smile. "Most people in your position would have done the minimum required and nothing more. You went far beyond your assigned duties, developed skills and knowledge bases that exceeded your rank and position, and maintained an investigative mindset even when actively discouraged from doing so." General Thornton's voice came through the speakers, carrying the weight of decades of command. "Robinson, we've reviewed your complete service record, including your psychological evaluations. Do you know what those evaluations actually say?" "That I'm too emotional for high-stress operations, sir," Indigo replied, the familiar phrase automatic after months of hearing it. "No," Thornton corrected. "They say you have an exceptional capacity for empathy and emotional intelligence, with the ability to read people and situations with unusual accuracy. The evaluator noted that you scored higher on predictive behavioral analysis than any candidate in the program's history. That's not a weakness, specialist. That's an extraordinarily rare strength." Indigo blinked, processing this reframing of information she'd always understood as criticism. "I don't understand, sir." "The person who labeled you as too emotional fundamentally misunderstood what emotional intelligence means in intelligence operations," Keller explained. "The ability to understand and predict human behavior is one of the most valuable assets an intelligence operative can possess. Combined with your analytical skills, your attention to detail, and your demonstrated ability to work effectively under extreme pressure, you represent exactly the kind of agent we're looking for." "Agent?" Indigo repeated, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. "We're offering you a position with the Defense Intelligence Service," Thornton said. "Specialized training in covert operations, advanced intelligence analysis, and field work. Your size, which has been treated as a liability in the Rangers, would become an asset in intelligence operations. Your ability to be underestimated becomes a tool rather than an obstacle." Indigo's mind raced. Everything she'd struggled against for the past 11 months, every limitation others had tried to impose on her, was suddenly being reframed as advantage. The emotional label that had haunted her was actually recognition of a rare skill. The thoroughness that made people uncomfortable was exactly what intelligence work required. "What about the Rangers?" she asked, glancing at Volkov. The commander's expression was complicated, mixing regret with pride. "Robinson, I'm not going to lie. I didn't see your potential when I should have. I let preconceptions blind me to what you were actually capable of. But now that I do see it, I recognize that keeping you in equipment verification would be a disservice to both you and the Defense Force." The training facility for the Defense Intelligence Service was located in a classified location in the mountains of Switzerland, a place that officially didn't exist on any map. Indigo arrived on a gray Monday morning, carrying a single duffel bag and a head full of questions about what she'd gotten herself into. The first week was designed to break conventional military thinking. The instructors, all former field operatives with decades of experience, made it clear that intelligence work required a completely different mindset than traditional combat operations. Success wasn't measured in completed missions but in information gathered, threats prevented, and operations that never became necessary because intelligence had already solved the problem. Indigo excelled immediately. The skills she developed while being dismissed as too emotional, too thorough, too obsessed with details, turned out to be exactly what intelligence work required. Her ability to read people, to notice inconsistencies in behavior and story, to maintain cover while gathering information, these were the core competencies of effective intelligence operations. By the third week, she was outperforming candidates with twice her experience. Her instructors noted in their reports that she had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate behavior patterns and identify deception. What they didn't know was that she'd been honing these skills for 11 months, learning to detect the subtle tells that indicated when people were dismissing her, underestimating her, or lying about their motivations. The physical training was different too. Instead of focusing on raw strength and endurance, intelligence operatives trained in adaptability and improvisation. Hand-to-hand combat techniques designed for smaller operators. Escape and evasion protocols that emphasized intelligence over force. Survival skills that assumed you'd be operating alone, without backup, in hostile territory. 4 months into training, Director Keller visited the facility for evaluations. Indigo was in the middle of a complex scenario, playing the role of an equipment inspector investigating potential corruption at a military installation. It was eerily similar to her real experience, but this time she was operating with official sanction and proper training. She identified the simulated corruption network within 3 days, gathered evidence that would hold up in court, and extracted herself from the situation without compromising her cover. When Keller debriefed her afterward, the director's expression was thoughtful. "You're ready for field assignment," Keller said without preamble. "Faster than any recruit we've trained in the past 5 years. The question is whether you feel ready." Indigo considered the question carefully. 4 months ago, she'd been counting equipment and being told to stay in her lane. Now she was being offered the chance to put her skills to use in ways that actually mattered, to prove that being underestimated could be turned into operational advantage. "I'm ready, ma'am," she said with quiet confidence. "Good. Because we have a situation that requires someone with your specific skill set." Keller pulled up a file on her tablet. "There's a military research facility in northern Finland conducting classified weapons development. Over the past 6 months, there have been indicators of potential security breaches and technology theft. We need someone to go in undercover, assess the situation, and identify any threats." "What's my cover?" Indigo asked, her mind already working through scenarios. "You'll be inserted as a logistics coordinator, ironically enough. It's a position that gives you access to most areas of the facility while being beneath the notice of anyone who might be conducting espionage. You'll be invisible, which is exactly where we need you." Indigo smiled slightly. Being invisible had been her curse in the Rangers. In intelligence work, it was a superpower. The assignment began 2 weeks later. Indigo arrived at the Finnish facility as Specialist Robinson, logistics coordinator, transferred from the Austrian training facility with excellent technical credentials and glowing recommendations. The facility commander barely glanced at her during check-in, immediately pegging her as low-level support staff. Perfect. Within 3 days, Indigo had identified suspicious patterns in equipment requisitions. Within a week, she'd narrowed down the potential security breach to 3 possible sources. Within 2 weeks, she'd confirmed that the facility's deputy director of research was passing classified information to a foreign intelligence service. The evidence she gathered was meticulous and irrefutable. When the arrest was made, the deputy director never even realized that the quiet logistics coordinator who'd asked him a few innocent questions about equipment access had been the one to expose his operation. Director Keller's message came through encrypted channels the day after the arrest. "Exceptional work, Agent Robinson. You've just prevented technology worth billions from falling into hostile hands. Welcome to the real mission. Agent Robinson. Not specialist. Not the equipment clerk. Not the girl who was too small, too emotional, too anything. An agent who'd proven that the qualities others had dismissed as weaknesses were actually her greatest strengths." 6 months into her work with the Defense Intelligence Service, Indigo Robinson had become someone new. Or perhaps she'd simply become who she always was beneath the limitations others had tried to impose on her. She'd completed 4 successful operations, each one dismantling threats that most people would never know existed. But Director Keller's summons to headquarters in Brussels carried a different tone than previous debriefings. When Indigo entered the secure conference room, she found not just Keller but also General Thornton and Commander Volkov. Her former commander looked older somehow, the weight of responsibility showing in new lines around his eyes. "Agent Robinson," Keller began, "we have a situation that requires your unique perspective and skills. It also requires you to return to the place where this all started." A holographic display activated, showing the Austrian mountain facility where Indigo had spent 11 frustrating months being told she wasn't enough. There have been 3 unexplained helicopter incidents at the facility over the past 2 months. Different pilots, different circumstances, but similar patterns to the sabotage network you helped expose. Volkov spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of personal responsibility. "We thought we'd rooted out everyone involved in Petrov's operation. Apparently, we were wrong. Someone is still operating inside the facility, and they're more careful this time. Standard investigations have found nothing." "You want me to go back undercover," Indigo said, understanding immediately. "Not exactly," Keller replied. "We want you to go back as yourself. As Specialist Robinson, equipment verification, reassigned after your stint with intelligence training. Everyone at the facility knows you exposed the first sabotage network. The saboteur will know you're a threat. So I'm bait," Indigo concluded. "You're an opportunity," Thornton corrected. "The saboteur knows you're dangerous, but they also remember you as the emotional equipment clerk who got lucky. They'll underestimate you again, which gives you the operational advantage." Indigo studied the facility schematics on the display, memories flooding back. The briefing room where she'd been dismissed. The maintenance bay where she'd nearly died. The corridors where she'd walked invisible, counting equipment while dreaming of actually maturing. "There's more," Volkov said quietly. "The incidents have all involved helicopters carrying Rangers who supported you during the Petrov investigation. Lieutenant Reyes was injured in one crash. 3 others have died. Someone is targeting people connected to you." The words hit Indigo like physical blows. People had died because they'd supported her, because they'd believed in her when others hadn't. The saboteur wasn't just continuing Petrov's operation, they were sending a message. "When do I leave?" Indigo asked, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Tomorrow," Keller replied. "But understand, Agent Robinson, this is voluntary. You've already done more than anyone could ask. No one would blame you for declining this assignment." Indigo thought about Lieutenant Reyes, who'd retrieved the audio recording that confirmed Petrov's guilt. About the 3 Rangers who'd died defending someone they'd once dismissed. About all the soldiers at that facility who deserved to train and serve without wondering if their equipment had been sabotaged. "I'll go," she said. "But I have conditions." Thornton raised an eyebrow. "You're in a position to set conditions?" "I am if you want this operation to succeed, sir. First, I need complete autonomy in my investigation. No interference from base command, no requirements to report through channels that might be compromised. Second, I need access to enhanced surveillance equipment disguised as standard logistics tools. And third, when I identify the saboteur, I need authorization to act immediately without waiting for approval." The 3 senior officers exchanged glances. Finally, Keller nodded. "Agreed. But Agent Robinson, understand that you'll be operating without visible backup. If things go wrong, we can't acknowledge your real role. As far as anyone knows, you're just Specialist Robinson, back from additional training." "I understand, ma'am. Being underestimated has always been my greatest advantage. Time to use it again." The next morning, Indigo packed the same duffel bag she'd carried away from the facility 6 months earlier. But this time, hidden among the regulation items, was equipment that would make her the most dangerous person on that base. Microsurveillance devices. Chemical detection kits. Communication tools that could penetrate any jamming. And most importantly, the confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of. As her transport helicopter approached the facility, Indigo looked down at the place that had once made her feel so small. Now she saw it differently, as an operational theater where she had every advantage because everyone there still thought they knew her. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Indigo's return to the Austrian facility was carefully orchestrated to appear mundane. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, processed through standard check-in procedures, and was assigned to the same quarters she'd occupied before. The base personnel who remembered her offered cautious greetings, their expressions mixing respect with uncertainty about why she'd returned. Commander Volkov made a show of meeting with her publicly, establishing the cover story. "Robinson, you've completed additional technical training with the intelligence service. You'll be resuming your logistics duties with expanded oversight of safety protocols. Given your previous success identifying equipment irregularities, we're giving you broader access to conduct inspections." The cover was perfect because it was mostly true. Indigo would be conducting inspections, just with objectives that went far beyond standard equipment verification. She spent her first 3 days re-establishing patterns, being visible, predictable, and seemingly absorbed in mundane duties. But she was also deploying surveillance equipment throughout the facility, microscopic devices that monitored conversations, tracked movements, and analyzed chemical residues on tools and components. The data began painting a picture within 48 hours. Someone was accessing the maintenance bay during off hours, using credentials that shouldn't have granted access to sensitive areas. The pattern was different from Petrov's operation, more cautious, more sophisticated, suggesting someone who'd learned from the first sabotage network's mistakes. On her 4th night back, Indigo was reviewing surveillance data in her quarters when she identified the saboteur's pattern. They were using a rotating schedule of access credentials, probably stolen from multiple personnel, making each individual access appear routine. But when viewed collectively, the pattern was unmistakable. More troubling was the target selection. The next scheduled helicopter flight carried Lieutenant Reyes, who'd recovered from her previous injuries and was returning to active duty. The saboteur was going after her again, and they'd planned it for tomorrow's mission. Indigo couldn't wait for official channels. She activated her emergency communication device and sent an encrypted message to Director Keller, "Target identified. Action tonight. Request authorization to proceed." The response came within minutes: "Authorized. Extract evidence. Neutralize threat. Backup standing by." Indigo geared up in her quarters, selecting equipment that was compact and silent. She wasn't going in as a soldier this time, she was operating as an intelligence agent with full authorization. The difference was profound. The maintenance bay was dark when she arrived at 0200 hours, but her thermal imaging showed a heat signature near the helicopter scheduled for tomorrow's flight. Someone was there, working on something they didn't want discovered. She moved silently through the shadows, getting close enough to identify the saboteur before taking action. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't even someone from Petrov's original network. It was Sergeant Davies, the same person who'd first started questioning her work, who'd expressed doubt about her inventory counts, who'd been part of the Whisper campaign that nearly destroyed her credibility. He was carefully applying a chemical compound to the helicopter's hydraulic lines, something that would cause catastrophic failure once the system heated during flight. Indigo activated her recording equipment, capturing video evidence of Davies's sabotage. Then she stepped out of the shadows, her voice carrying absolute authority in the darkness. "Step away from the helicopter, Sergeant." Davies spun around, his face cycling through shock, fear, and calculation. His hand moved toward a weapon in his belt, but Indigo already had hers drawn, trained steadily on his center mass. "Don't," she said quietly. "I have video evidence of everything you've done. Armed resistance only adds to your charges." "You don't understand," Davies said, his voice desperate. "This isn't about money or contracts. This is about justice." "Justice for what?" "For my brother." Davies's face twisted with grief and rage. He died in the first sabotage incident, the one Petrov orchestrated. Everyone said it was an accident, equipment failure. But I knew something was wrong. When you exposed Petrov, I realized my brother had been murdered for a defense contractor's profit margin. Indigo kept her weapon steady, but her mind raced through implications. So you're continuing the sabotage? That doesn't make sense. I'm targeting the people who knew, Davies said. The ones who suspected something was wrong but did nothing. Volkov ignored warning signs. Reyes dismissed early maintenance concerns. They're all complicit in my brother's death, and they deserve to feel the same fear he felt when his helicopter went down. Your brother wouldn't want this, Indigo said, her voice carrying the emotional intelligence that others had once called a weakness. He was a ranger. He believed in protecting people, not killing them for revenge. You don't know what he believed. No, but I know what he'd think of you sabotaging helicopters and putting innocent people at risk. That's not justice, Sergeant. That's just more death. Davies's hand trembled on his weapon, torn between grief and rationality. In that moment of hesitation, Indigo made her move. The confrontation in the maintenance bay lasted less than 30 seconds. Indigo moved with precision born from months of intelligence training, disarming Davies with techniques designed for exactly this scenario. By the time base security arrived, responding to her silent alarm, Davies was secured and the evidence was preserved. Commander Volkov arrived minutes later, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. Robinson, report. Sergeant Davies has been continuing the sabotage operation, sir. His motivation was revenge for his brother's death in one of Petrov's incidents. He was targeting personnel he believed were complicit and ignoring warning signs. Indigo's voice was professional, detached, nothing like the emotional equipment clerk they remembered. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Davies's quarters yielded evidence of months of planning, detailed files on his targets, and a manifesto explaining his twisted logic. The chemical compound he'd been using was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by standard safety protocols, requiring the enhanced surveillance equipment Indigo had deployed to identify it. Lieutenant Reyes sought out Indigo the day after Davies's arrest, finding her conducting actual equipment inspections in the supply depot. You saved my life again, Reyes said without preamble. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, Indigo replied. You believed in me when others didn't. You retrieved that audio recording that proved Petrov's guilt. That's what Rangers do, we support each other. You're not just a Ranger anymore though, are you? Reyes asked perceptively. The way you moved, the equipment you had, the authority you operated with. That's not standard logistics training. Indigo smiled slightly. I'm still a Ranger, Lieutenant. Just a Ranger with an expanded mission profile. 2 weeks later, Indigo stood once again in a briefing room at the facility. But this time, she stood at the front alongside Commander Volkov and Director Keller, who'd arrived for a formal ceremony. The assembled Rangers represented every specialty in the facility, all gathered to hear what would happen to the woman who'd exposed 2 separate sabotage operations. 6 months ago, Volkov began, his voice carrying across the room, I told Specialist Robinson to focus on her assigned duties and stop exceeding her scope. I was wrong. Her refusal to accept artificial limitations, her dedication to understanding systems beyond her specialty, her persistence in developing skills others deemed unnecessary, all of these things that made some people uncomfortable turned out to be exactly what we needed. He turned to Indigo. Specialist Robinson, you've been operating under dual assignment for the past 6 months. Today, that assignment becomes permanent. You're being promoted to the rank of agent and will continue working with the Defense Intelligence Service while maintaining your Ranger certification. You'll be one of the first operatives trained to work across both specialties. The room erupted in applause, genuine this time, from Rangers who'd learned that strength came in many forms. Indigo stood at attention, accepting the promotion with quiet dignity, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From the equipment clerk everyone dismissed to the agent everyone respected. From being told she was too emotional to learning that emotional intelligence was a rare and valuable skill. From being underestimated to turning that underestimation into operational advantage. After the ceremony, as Rangers congratulated her and asked questions about intelligence work, Indigo felt something shift inside her. Not validation, exactly, though that was part of it. More like a deep understanding that she'd never needed them to believe in her potential. She'd always had it. They'd just needed to stop getting in the way of her proving it. Director Keller approached as the crowd dispersed. Your next assignment begins in 2 weeks. There's a situation in Eastern Europe that requires someone who can operate in plain sight while conducting sophisticated intelligence operations. Interested? Indigo thought about the scared equipment clerk who'd stood on this tarmac 11 months ago, watching helicopters fly missions she'd never be part of. Then she thought about the agent she'd become, someone who'd proven that being small, being emotional, being underestimated could all be advantages if you refused to accept other people's limitations. I'm interested, ma'am, she said with quiet confidence. I'm ready. As she walked out of the facility that evening, the sun setting over the Austrian mountains in brilliant orange and gold, Indigo reflected on everything she'd learned. The most important lesson wasn't about combat or intelligence work or proving people wrong. It was that the only opinion that truly mattered about what she was capable of was her own. The Rangers who'd once called her tears behind her back now called her Agent Robinson to her face. The facility that had once felt like a prison now felt like a launching pad for missions that would take her around the world. And somewhere out there, equipment clerks and logistics specialists and support personnel who felt invisible were about to learn that they didn't need anyone's permission to be extraordinary. They just needed to refuse to stay in the lanes others tried to assign them, to develop skills beyond their job descriptions, and to be ready when opportunity finally arrived. Because it would arrive. It always did for people who prepared for it. Indigo Robinson had been thrown from a metaphorical helicopter her entire career, told she'd never survive without the support others deemed necessary. She'd proven them wrong by building her own parachute from determination, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations. And she'd landed exactly where she was always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.